Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX. Well, let's take a look at some of the top stories. Today, U.S. President Donald Trump will host Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, pushing a Gaza peace proposal amid European recognition of Palestinian statehood. This marks Netanyahu's fourth visit since Trump returned to office, as Israel seeks to shore up U.S. support while facing growing criticism. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed building a joint aerial defense shield with its European partners to counter threats from Russia. Kyiv argues its experience with airborne threats would help NATO amid Russia's recent airspace incursions in Poland and the Baltic states, which Russia denies. Sweden is sending radars and anti-drone systems to Denmark to secure upcoming EU summits in Copenhagen after drone incursion disrupted air traffic at 6 airports, according to Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson. Denmark has now banned civilian drone flights and seen NATO and German forces boost airspace surveillance amid rising tensions. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has now ordered 200 Oregon National Guard troops under federal authority to Portland following President Donald Trump's announcement to deploy troops to protect federal immigration facilities. Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield filed a lawsuit claiming the President Donald Trump exceeded his powers. A UN-backed report has revealed that Myanmar's military destroyed Rohingya villages and mosques after the 2017 expulsion of the Muslim minority, repurposing the land for security outposts. The investigation also found private firms assisted the military, while Myanmar denies genocide and funding cuts to the international investigation. Moldova's pro-EU ruling party scored a resounding victory over its Russian-leaning rival in a key parliamentary election. These reports are reported by their official results. The win is seen as a strong endorsement of Moldova's bid to join the European Union. At least 4 people were killed and 8 wounded in a shooting at the church in Michigan, U.S., when gunmen rammed a vehicle into the building, opened fire, and then set it alight. Officers engaged and killed him, while investigators warned that more victims may still be found. Former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra has petitioned for a royal pardon for his 1-year jail sentence after returning from 15 years of self-exile. The ex-Prime Minister was jailed after the Supreme Court ruled he had not served his original 8-year sentence. This follows the removal of his daughter, former Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra, last month. The final day of the UN General Assembly's 80th session is now officially underway, and among the key leaders expected to address the general debate today are the permanent representatives of Canada, Denmark, Moldova, and North Korea. With this being the final day of proceedings, UNGA-80 President Annalena Baerbock will also deliver closing remarks at the end of the day's proceedings, marking the final close of the United Nations 80th General Assembly. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Thomas Porteous. He's a correspondent joining us live from New York. Thank you very much, Tom, for joining us. Now, as the 80th session of the UNGA concludes today, how would you assess the overall impact of this year's proceedings on global diplomacy?
Well, yes, Asuma. Of course, this week has been significant in diplomacy. However, in practicality, whether anything makes a difference is another thing. When it comes to speeches, when it comes to positioning, of course, things have been clear. However, what has been very, very evident is that The United Nations itself needs reforming. Multiple leaders have spoken out against it. And given the backdrop of the global climate, of course, two huge ongoing conflicts have of this conference. It's going to be seen if the United Nations can once again become a global peacekeeping body. Of course, we have seen huge speeches and huge moments from across the week. That we opened the week, of course, with the recognition of a Palestinian state from many of Israel's allies, which some would say is mainly symbolic and others would say is theatrics. However, it was supported by Palestinians and slammed by supporters of the Israeli cause. Then followed President Donald Trump. He, of course, slammed the institution in a huge way and then claimed to set wars himself. Once again, critiquing that institution across the river from me here. So a huge week, Asuma, but what goes to show is that the United Nations isn't really taken seriously by these leaders anymore. Of course, they do show up, they do give their speeches, it is their chance to put their messages clear, but the institution is but see those reforms come to fruition or not.
And Thomas, keeping that in mind, with leaders from diverse nations still taking the stage today, what do you think are the key takeaways from the final day of UNGA?
Well, Asuma, most of the heads of state have spoken. Today is foreign ministers and other high-ranking officials. Of course, you've got Canada speaking today, North Korea, both of which have their foreign ministers attending. Viktor Orban's Hungary is there, although he himself is not. The Holy See as well, of course, the Vatican is also speaking today. But when it comes to significant developments, we're not expecting much. The last day, in reality, was on Saturday, where the likes of S. Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, and Sergei Lavrov made those huge statements in front of the General Assembly. But when it comes to the United Nations here in New York, it is pretty much all over. All eyes now move over to Washington, especially for today, during that Trump-Benjamin Netanyahu meeting, where we have seen a huge week of particularly diplomatic developments, where, of course, he spoke and we saw huge opposition to him, both before his speech, when over 100 diplomats walked out of that hall, and throughout the week in numerous speeches, including even one leader who had his visa revoked due to his massive opposition to the Israeli operation in Gaza. But of course, today we are looking over to the White House, where Donald Trump hopes the Israeli president, and contradictory to Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, which made it sound like this war is not over. We will see. Donald Trump says there's something to look forward to being announced there, and we'll see what the developments are coming from Washington today.
Thank you for sharing that from New York. Now, we are also joined by our guest, Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you, Mark, for joining us again. Now, I'll ask you the same as the 80th sessions of the UNGA concludes today. How would you assess the overall impact of this year's proceedings?
Good to join you again. This was good to see Thomas reporting from New York. Well, they've gathered. It's the 80th, I think, as Thomas has pointed out. There is much reform that the UN needs to have. If we look at various allegations that have gone on from a long time in regard to UN soldiers on the ground, etc., and various people need to be held accountable there. Plus, you know, the UN up until 2023 has put 143 resolutions against Israel, more than any other country. I think the one lesser to that starts at 43. The theatrics that we've seen, where people have walked out because of Bibi Netanyahu's speech, the other theatrics where we have seen in regard to the UK, France, Canada, and Australia, then saying that we will recognise a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, which has been denied 4 times previously. There is, and that because of vetoes. It's just as I say, theatrics. It will not be then taken any further. But other than the fact that the UN building desperately needs refurbishment, as President Trump pointed out, especially as a number of years ago, he nearly got the contract and just lost in regard to sorting it out. The thing is, it is perceived as the world stage for various leaders from around the world to come and make the comments, come and grandstand. If we look at some of these people, various dictators as well, and we need to look at how some of their countries are run. So on the one hand, it gives us an interesting opportunity to look at various leaders, how they view the world, how the perception that we can gain by what they're saying with how they're actually running their countries, Asima.
Right, and with that in mind, this year it's the first time the 80th leader of UN will be women. So do you think that after 80 years of United Nations, we're finally seeing a woman leading this organization? Don't you think this is a little late for such a big organization that's supposed to be an example for the world to take 80 years to make a woman a leader?
Well, of course, they're also over here within the UK, there's about to be election for the new Archbishop of Canterbury. And then there's the discussion, will that be a woman as well? And I say respectfully, knowing your gender and who I'm talking to, the issue is this, is not necessarily about putting a woman or putting a man in there. Is actually putting the right person in through meritocracy that is actually capable of actually doing the job. One of the things that was found out recently when Keir Starmer over here, the Prime Minister, I will give an example, then touted before Rachel Reeves, who was a woman, who then as Chancellor of the Exchequer, given her first budget as the first female MP, as a Member of Parliament, the first female Chancellor, has not exactly done very well in that job. And it's got nothing to do with gender. We want to see the right person for the job. It's on meritocracy. Can the person actually do it? And I say respectfully that gender politics is something that we do, my humble opinion, need to push back on. It's looking who is available, who will do the best job, depending on whether they are a man or a woman, and then let's get them in there. Assuming.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on. U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are set to meet at the White House today to discuss a potential peace deal to end the 2-year war in Gaza. The U.S. President says a deal is likely, with proposals including the release of all hostages within 48 hours, Israel freeing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, and amnesty for Hamas members who commit to peace. The plan also outlines a gradual Israeli withdrawal and a transitional Gaza government, while acknowledging Palestinian aspirations for a future state. Further, Netanyahu faces challenges from hardline coalition partners who reject any role for the Palestinian Authority or discussion of a Palestinian state. U.S. officials hope both sides will agree, with President Trump expressing optimism about a breakthrough. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Mohammed Osman. He's an international relations specialist, joins us live from Cairo. Thank you very much, Osman, for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, Osman, so far, what do we know about what's on the table for this highly anticipated discussion of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump?
Thank you for having me, Asuma. Greetings to you and to your audience. I think that, of course, quite in the center of the negotiations or the discussions that will be held today in the fourth Trump-Netanyahu summit in the United States will be the American initiative for a ceasefire and an eventual settlement in Gaza. It seems that the Americans now are proposing more workable solutions that are more in touch with certain realities and that take into account the interests of the Arab countries and the Palestinians as well, and not only the Israelis. So basically, it's more balanced. It's far from perfect. It reeks of imperfection. Actually, it's not even good what Trump is proposing. However, it is much better than what the Israelis were trying to push forward. That is the complete long-term reoccupation of the Gaza Strip by Israel, the prevention of the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, and eventually the depopulation of Gaza, which is basically an act of ethnic cleansing and genocide, of course. So the Americans now are pushing forward something that is much more reasonable, something that will require the Israelis to eventually pull out of the Gaza Strip, even though they do not impose a certain timetable for this gradual withdrawal. However, it is established as one of the provisions of the agreement. And of course, in return, the Palestinians or the Palestinian factions, namely Hamas, will have to release the hostages and the detainees within 48 hours, and they will have to also relinquish power in Gaza and disarm. Of course, these are very, very ambitious provisions or expectations from both Israel and Hamas, and I know that the agreement will definitely not be convenient for both Israel and Hamas. However, certain concessions have to be taken. The Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even other Islamic countries like Pakistan and Indonesia and Turkey, they have all told President Trump when they were meeting with him last week that they are on board with what he is proposing. So now it's up to them to pressure Hamas and the Palestinian factions in order to agree to this agreement. The main problem of contention is Israel, and this is up to the United States to do. Of course, Netanyahu will never agree willingly to such an agreement or such a settlement. He will not be convinced to adhere to these arrangements. However, he can be compelled by the Americans. This will be put to the test today at today's meeting. Netanyahu already had a reportedly very tense meeting with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Both Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and an associate of Israel, and also Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy to the Middle East and other regions in the world. So those two American officials have met with Netanyahu to try to convince him to agree to the proposal. We will see what will happen in the meeting. It's either that Trump will have his way and impose his vision on Netanyahu, and then we will actually there will be an actual prospect of ending this war in the very near future, or Netanyahu will leave a lasting impression on Trump and will convince him to change his mind or to make alterations or amendments to the agreement that will not be agreeable to the Palestinian side, which will basically push everything back to square one, and the war will resume without any constraints. So I think we will have answers to our very valid questions within the next few hours, Asuma.
Yes, thank you very much, Osman, Mohammed Osman, for joining us and sharing that insight and enlightening us with the details. Now we move on to North America again. Now, at least 4 people have died and 8 others are injured after a gunman drove a vehicle into a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Michigan, and he opened fire during yesterday's service. Police identified the suspect as 40-year-old Thomas Jacob Sanford, a former Marine and a war veteran who is killed at the scene after exchanging gunfire with officers. Authorities say he also set the building on fire and 3 improvised explosive devices are recovered. Investigators believe more victims could be found in the rubble, as the chapel is now total loss. The FBI is leading the case, calling it an act of targeted violence. President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer all condemned the attack and expressed condolences as the investigation continues. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Thomas Porteous. He's my colleague and correspondent, joins us live from New York. Thank you, Thomas, for joining us again. Now, given the details of the attack, including gunmen's past, how do you think this incident will shed light on the broader issue of veterans?
Well, yes, Suma. Details of this horrific attack are slowly creeping through. And of course, the gun violence in the UK remains the US remains a huge issue. Hundreds of mass shootings here in the United States every year. However, each state has their own laws. Now, what's interesting about this one is that Michigan itself has relatively strict gun laws. You have to conceal weapons in the state. You have to go through relatively strict background checks in order to purchase a weapon that this suspect used. And they're relatively rare here. Now, Flint is a kind of which is where this attack took place. Is a quiet town, of course, where things like this are extremely unexpected and unprecedented. What we know about this is that, of course, this attacker drove this vehicle into this church and had explosives in his car and opened fire on the crowd. Of course, very grisly images there. And, of course, we don't quite know what, in particular, the motive of the attack was. What we do know is that he was a U.S. Marine, a U.S. soldier, previously deployed in Iraq over 10 years ago now, but there's no inkling so far what did cause this attack. Thomas Jacob Sanford, who's around 40 years old, is what we have been told. He has been killed, and so what will be very, very interesting is finding out what was his motivation. But of course, the thing is, when shootings like this happen around elsewhere in the world, you'd expect to see some sort of legislative action. We can't expect that from the United States. The National Rifle Association, otherwise known as the NRA, is extremely powerful, and of course, Republicans do very much relish that Second Amendment right, and so we can't really see any developments coming out of this in regard to any form. But of course, what will be interesting is seeing the motivations of the attacker and to see how this unfolds that way.
And Thomas, with the FBI taking in charge of these investigations now, what are the key challenges in determining the motive behind, and what more can you tell us about this incident?
I do apologise, Asuma, I can't hear you too well, but we'll just talk about the incident a little bit more. We, of course, know the name of the shooter, the fact that this could have been a bigger attack, and that there were several explosives found in the car. Thankfully, only 4 people were killed during the attack on that day, where it could have been far greater. Luckily, the suspect was neutralized by police. 2 additional bodies were also found, with the charred remains of the church believed to be involved in this fire that was caused by the incident. Among the wounded people, of 8, at least 1 is still believed to be in critical condition, sadly. Authorities are treating this as an act of targeted violence here and not something that is completely random. The suspect clearly is what they're insinuating planned this ridiculously and probably most likely planned a much wider attack given the amount of weaponry in his vehicle. Of course, as soon as we get details about the investigation, we'll bring it to you here on NewsX.
Much, Thomas, for joining us and sharing that insight from US. Now we move on. Russia's defense ministry has released video in which its forces can be seen taking control of a village, Shandrai-Holov, in Ukraine's Donetsk region. As per reports, some of the footage has been verified. Road layouts, buildings, and tree lines matched with the satellite imagery. Moscow has announced today that its forces have secured the area. This marks another advance in Russia's push through eastern Ukraine, though Kyiv has not commented on the claim. The Donetsk region has seen some of the fiercest fighting since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, with control of even small villages becoming highly contested as both sides dig in along the eastern front. Now, for this discussion, we are joined by Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you, Mark, for staying with us. Now, we saw this news and we see that Kyiv has not commented yet about this announcement. How should we, as international community, interpret this Russia's military advances, and what steps can be taken to ensure accurate information about this war?
You raise such an important question, and as you've said, in the Donetsk region, and that region has been fiercely contested since the Russian invasion of February 2022, and there are terms like, both sides digging in, which refers to me to like First World War, trench war. And I think maybe if I have my facts right, that village was taken a few years ago, fairly early on within the invasion, if I had those facts right. But it just shows you suddenly it's taken back, then maybe it's taken back again. This ebb and flow that is going on. It sounds really awful to even discuss the fact that we're talking about human beings that are dying on both sides and people are trying to kill each other. But this is the reality on the ground, which is literally fighting for each individual village. What is also, if this is true, and there is independent comment on this from Ukrainian reporters reporter in one case, where to say in the last few days in that village that the Russians are holding one child as a shield to make sure that Ukraine forces don't shoot them back and don't retaliate. As they're holding this child, and sadly, in one report, if this is true, saying that the parents and the adults have been shot in that regard, and that's why you're asking the question: what do we then believe on both sides? Because the propaganda is so rife. However, in this kind of cases, when people are saying that 2,000 plus children are going missing, maybe it's far more than that, where families sadly have been caught in the crossfire, and then these poor children are then without parents, and the UN has been reporting on these. The reports are then passed on to them. So this is so difficult to walk through this at times. What we do know, as a report that someone said, it would take a number of years yet for even Russia to advance to take even more territory from the Ukraine, and the cost of that in regard to the human life, which we're looking at 1 million on the Russian side, maybe 800,000 on the Ukrainian side. I don't throw these figures out just as if it's like willy-nilly. We're talking about human beings and the suffering on both sides, and then the Russians have lost a lot of tanks and a lot of armor, and it seems to have not been as simple for them as maybe they would have actually thought to then advance into the Ukraine. Always the big challenge is to really try and look at various reports from all different directions and to weigh that up. That's the biggest challenge we have. And of course, the Russians are very, very good at denial. They're very good at propaganda. They're very good at pushing their thoughts out there. And that is also this whole thing of, you know, another war front, and propaganda is extremely important for both sides to say, this is what we think, this is what is going on, this is our truth. But we have that challenge to then march through that and find out, as I say, from a variety of different sources, so that we can then present the evidence. Asuma.
Yes, indeed. And thank you very much, Mark Sutherland, for joining us and sharing that insight from London as a geopolitical commentator. Now, this is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.